There may come a moment after what we call awakening when the light begins to fade, not because it was false, not because nothing happened, but because the first shock of seeing cannot last forever. You wake up in the same room. The same life is still there. The same body, the same responsibilities, the same relationships, the same unfinished wounds. And yet something in you has been touched by a truth that cannot be fully forgotten. For a while, awakening may have felt like a breakthrough, a rupture, a sudden opening in the walls of the self. It may have felt as if everything had been revealed at once, as if the whole architecture of your life had been exposed from the inside. But then the intensity settles, the brightness softens, the extraordinary becomes memory, and what remains is much more difficult than the moment itself. You now have to live with what was opened. This is where many people become confused, because the old structure of the mind does not simply disappear after one glimpse of truth. The habits remain, the fear remains, the need to hold on remains. Only now, these things often return wearing a more spiritual face. Before, the mind may have chased success, approval, love, status, security, or control. After awakening, it may begin chasing depth, stillness, purity, realization, or the image of being someone who has seen beyond the ordinary world. The object has changed, but the movement is still the same. The mind is still trying to become something, still trying to secure itself, still trying to build a new identity out of the very experience that seemed to dissolve identity. This is one of the most subtle traps after awakening. The self does not always come back loudly. Sometimes it comes back quietly, dressed in silence, humility, wisdom, and spiritual language. And because it looks more refined, it becomes harder to see. Slowly, a vast empty space begins to open. You no longer fully belong to the old world. But you also do not yet know how to live from the new one. You stand in between. And this in-between space can feel more painful than the life you left behind. The old answers no longer convince you. The old ambitions no longer pull you with the same force. The old forms of comfort feel too small. But the new way has not yet become stable. There is no clear map, no solid ground, no familiar identity to rest inside. And from this strange middle place, hidden conflicts begin to rise. You start looking back at everything that led you here. The years of healing, the practices, the teachers, the books, the retreats, the communities, the moments of devotion, the long effort to become more conscious, more whole, more free. And suddenly, a question appears with almost unbearable sharpness. What did all of that actually solve? Because here you are, still human, still wounded, still reactive, still unstable in places you thought should have been healed by now. Still facing money, family, loneliness, work, fatigue, disappointment, and the ordinary pressures of life. The spiritual path, which once felt sacred, may begin to look like a long detour. You may feel that you lost years, that certain relationships slipped away, that opportunities passed while you were searching for something deeper, that your life became more complicated, not simpler. And the light that once seemed undeniable begins to fall under suspicion. Was it awakening? Was it a psychological event? Was it a nervous system opening? Was it imagination? Was it a projection created by a mind desperate for meaning? At first, the doubt may be quiet. Then it may become rebellion. You may begin to reject the very path that once carried you. You may turn away from meditation, from spiritual language, from teachers, from communities, from everything that once felt sacred. But beneath this rejection, there is often something more vulnerable. The problem is not always that the experience was false. The deeper pain is that you cannot return to it. You cannot touch it again in the same way. The fire that once opened everything is no longer available on command, and the mind, which wants certainty, begins to panic inside the unknown. Then a heavy stillness may settle over your life. Not peace, not true rest, but a kind of dull suspension. You continue doing what life asks of you. You work, you eat, you answer messages, you speak to people. You keep moving through the surface of the day. But inwardly, something feels disconnected. It is not that you hate life. It is that life no longer tastes the way it used to. The things that once motivated you no longer reach the same place. Old goals feel distant. Old pleasures feel thin. Even pain can begin to feel strangely abstract, as if it is happening behind a layer of glass. You are not fully in the old life, but you are not fully born into another one, so you remain suspended, unable to return, unable to move forward. And this suspension slowly becomes exhausting. A new kind of suffering appears. You suffer because you are suffering. You feel sadness, and then you are disappointed that sadness is still there. You feel fear, and then you judge yourself for not being more awake. You feel anger, and then you accuse yourself of being unconscious. The original emotion is painful enough, but now another layer appears on top of it. Resistance to the emotion, shame about the emotion, a spiritualized self-judgment that says, if I had truly awakened, this should not be happening. This is where suffering begins to multiply, not only because life hurts, but because you believe the hurt should no longer belong to you. Another subtle difficulty begins to form. You become constantly aware of yourself. You watch your thoughts. You watch your reactions. You watch your emotions rising and falling. You watch yourself speaking. You watch yourself listening. You watch yourself being a person. At first, this distance may feel like freedom. There is space between you and the storm. There is a sense that you are no longer completely swallowed by every emotion. But over time, the same distance can turn into another prison. You begin to live at the edge of experience, watching life instead of entering it. You see too much. You understand too quickly. You can detect the ego in others. You can recognize their defenses, their projections, their unconscious patterns. You can name the mechanism as it unfolds. But this clarity may quietly separate you from the warmth of being human. You are not lost in life anymore, but you are not fully touching it either. The witness becomes a wall. What once felt like awakening begins to feel like exile. You are present but not intimate, aware but not alive, detached but not free, and the space that once felt holy begins to feel cold. In the middle of this uncertainty, another movement appears. You try to hold on to the image of being an awakened person. You shape your words around it. You shape your posture around it. You try to remain calm, deep, balanced, and wise. Maybe you begin helping others. Maybe you become the one who explains, guides, heals, or understands. And some of this may be genuine. It may even help people. But underneath it, there can be a quiet attachment to the role itself. The role of the one who has awakened, the one who sees, the one who is beyond ordinary confusion. And the more your inner reality fails to match this image, the more painful the split becomes. Inside, there may be fear, confusion, resentment, desire, loneliness, and shame. Outside, there is the image of someone who should be beyond all of that. So you begin to feel like a fraud, not because everything is fake, but because something in you is still clinging to an image that can no longer hold the whole truth. You cannot fully live inside the old identity, but now you cannot easily step out of the spiritual one either. You have become attached to the self that was supposed to disappear. At times, the response is to practice harder, to search more intensely, to look for a new method, a new teacher, a new system, a more powerful transmission, a deeper realization. Somewhere, you imagine there must be one final light strong enough to burn away the confusion. One final breakthrough, one final state, one final answer. But the deeper movement is not always love of truth. Sometimes it is fear of emptiness. You are not seeking because the heart is open. You are seeking because you cannot bear the space where nothing is certain. You want light because darkness feels unbearable. You want realization because uncertainty feels like death. You want a final answer because the mind cannot stand being suspended without one. This is not wrong. It is human, but it must be seen clearly. Because as long as the search is driven by fear of emptiness, even the highest spiritual pursuit becomes another way of escaping what is already here. At other times, the movement goes in the opposite direction. You try to become normal again. You try to return to the old layer of life. You tell yourself that awakening was just an illusion, a phase, a psychological disturbance, a beautiful but misleading event. You decide that ordinary life is the only real thing, so you return to work, to pleasure, to relationships, to ambition, to the tangible world. You try to love what you once loved. You try to desire what you once desired. You try to live as if nothing happened, and for a while this may feel mature, grounded, sane. You may even tell yourself that seeing awakening as an illusion is the real awakening, that returning to ordinary life is the final wisdom. But deep underneath, something remains unresolved, because whether you accept it or reject it, something did happen. There was a moment when the old frame of perception collapsed. There was a moment when reality appeared more naked, more immediate, more true than the life you had been living inside. And even if you now call it illusion, the memory of that seeing does not disappear. It simply goes underground. It waits beneath the surface. And one day when the old structures reach their limit again, it may return, not as a memory, but as a question that can no longer be avoided. Eventually, a deeper realization begins to appear. The issue is not whether the empty space is right or wrong. The issue is that the mind has lost its old anchors. It no longer knows where to place itself. This is the true power of awakening, not the bliss, not the visions, not the intensity, not the sense that you have finally arrived. The real force of awakening is that it pulls awareness out of the old world and throws it into a vast space where the former structures no longer function. The mind still tries to cling, but the old anchors have become unstable. The stories no longer hold. The identities no longer feel solid. The beliefs no longer carry the same authority. The old meanings still appear, but they no longer convince the whole being. At first, this can feel like freedom, like leaving gravity, like floating above the weight of the life you once took to be absolute. There may be spaciousness, clarity, lightness, even beauty. But sooner or later you have to look directly at where you are. And then the same space that once felt liberating may reveal itself as an abyss. No ground, no definition, no map, no fixed self to return to. This is where the deepest fears arise. The fear of being lost, the fear of having no direction, the fear of not knowing who you are, the fear of losing your place in the world, the fear of emptiness, the fear of never arriving anywhere again. But if you look closely, these fears do not come from the empty space itself. They come from the memory of the old world. You fear losing ground because you were used to standing on something. You fear not knowing because you were used to certainty. You fear having no identity because you were used to surviving through one. The empty space is not creating the fear. It is revealing what the mind has always depended on. And perhaps the next door opens only when you stop trying to escape this space. Not by filling it, not by explaining it, not by turning it into a new identity, not by running back to the old life, not by chasing another spiritual peak, but by learning to remain, to stay with the uncertainty, to live inside the not knowing without immediately turning it into a problem, to allow the mind to lose its grip without rushing to give it another object to hold. This is not passive resignation. It is a deeper kind of courage. The courage to let the old structures fall without demanding that a new self appear immediately. The courage to stop performing awakening. The courage to stop rejecting confusion. The courage to stop turning emptiness into failure. Slowly, something softens. The mind no longer fights the space as if it were an enemy. The emptiness is no longer treated as a mistake. And when it is no longer seen as a problem to solve, it begins to reveal another quality. Stillness, depth, a quiet intimacy with life that does not depend on certainty. Not the loud brightness of the first awakening. Not the pride of someone who has understood. Not the great search for final truth. Something much quieter, something almost invisible, a silent opening, empty but not dead, still but not numb, vast but not distant. And from within that empty space, life begins to be touched again. Not as something to conquer, not as something to escape, not as something that must confirm who you are, but as something that can finally be met without the old demand for a solid self at the center of it. Perhaps this is why the space after awakening feels so difficult. It is not the failure of awakening. It is the place where awakening stops being an experience and begins to dismantle the one who wanted to own it.